arrived on Earth faster than our early warning system now. China and Europe are equally vulnerable. China is actually installing a high-power electrical grid that is more vulnerable than that of the US. And Europe and the other developed nations will be similarly impacted. What's important is that as far as a reality check, the head of the European Space Agency, Space Weather, says, quote, "This is a fair and balanced report." So that's some of the possibilities. Now, these are the G20 with the Queen. And if we look at the Obama White House website and ask about 2012, 2013, the only thing that is on the website as far as energy policy is that the US wants to ensure that 10% of our electricity comes from renewable sources by 2012. So that's a policy statement, and this is entirely off the radar. So here's a key question. Obviously, if we had smart leadership at the helm of the planet, we would be getting off the grid, and we'd be using some of the non-polluting zero-point non-polluting energy sources such as anti-gravitic technology and, importantly, teleportation technology, which would revolutionize transport on this planet and which are available now on an operational basis in the black budget economy. So the question is, are we being set up to fail and suffer an effective systems collapse if the 2012 to 2013 solar flares materialize? Now, here are some other impacts. The effect of solar cycle 24 on human behavior, and that is that sunspots give up solar flares that increase negative ionization on Earth, and increased negative ionization during sunspot maximum periods increases human excitability and activity. So some of the regularities in studying past solar cycles is that there's a definite tendency for pandemics to occur during solar maxima. Now, the current H1N1 virus may be being manipulated and, it's being manipulated at a time in which, if we go back centuries, we know that there's a tendency for pandemics to occur. And this is dating back to the early 1700s. So if there is an attempt in the H1N1 virus and the mandatory vaccination scheme, then it's truly diabolical, because people are working with historical data that shows that there's a tendency for pandemics to occur. Some of the research shows that geomagnetic storms cause different reactions, primarily in males. Women seem to experience less change in accordance with the sun's behavior. Men may become increasingly irritable and aggressive. Either that or they become more creative. So there's a definite choice to be made there. But this brings us to the index of human excitability, which was developed by a Soviet professor and he traced the incidence of wars, revolutions, riots, expeditions, and migrations from 500 BC to 1922 AD. And what he shows is that he divided them into 4 periods and showed that in period 2 and 3, which correspond to 2010 to 11, and it's coming up in this next year, and 2012 to 2014, there is, to take the maximum, in 2012 to 2014, it's the maximum excitability, the election of liberals or radicals, mass demonstrations, riots, revolutions, war, and the resolution of most pressing demands. So that's what has occurred historically during the solar maxima. Now, there is, and we don't have time to get into it today, but we do have another PowerPoint which shows the effect of a space-based weapon of mass destruction known as HAARP, which you may have heard of, and it's demonstrated mood and mind control abilities. So we don't know. HAARP is another variable which may be offsetting the effects of the index of human mass excitability and the effects of solar during the solar maximum of sunspots, in that HAARP can render entire populations extremely apathetic and confused. And there's deep evidence that that is occurring. And one reason, we may have intersecting variables here, that one reason why our body politic is so apathetic sources from systematic mind control through technologies such as HAARP. But it's also related to the sunspot cycles in that we're in a deep solar minimum now. I mean, there's all these outrages happening, and the human population seems relatively apathetic to, begin to move around it. What this data is very hopeful, because if we have a rapid swing in sunspots over the next few years, it'll be hopefully not the time for wars, but the time for social breakthroughs. And this brings us to several possible visions that we can have of solar cycle 24, 2009 to 2020. The disintegration vision is global and regional wars, the Armageddon meme, and this is a meme employed by the permanent war economy, whose business it is to promote war as an industrial activity and to keep us organized around war within the dialectic of enemies, and to have all of our productive capacity and our mental capacity and our emotional capacity, our fears, directed toward war, which is an industrial activity like making shoes. The collapse of the world energy grid, which we've talked about from solar flares, the collapse of this global financial system, which George talked about earlier today, the collapse of nation states. One example, prominent example, is that of the US, and there's a meme now to deconstruct the US as a nation. I should say that back in the mid-70s, when I was a futurist at Stanford Research Institute, that was being actively studied there. And so that is the breakup of the US into about 5 or 6 region nations. And so in my mind, there's a question as to whether that's an attempted social engineering to deconstruct what what